I feel very called to become a member of the Catholic Church.
Love the Catholic Church. It's just the best place to be.
From the studios of EWTN, this is Open Line. In North America, call toll-free 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
I'll tell you what, we are so blessed here at EWTN. God takes such amazing care of us. You know, we have such a tremendous relationship with such a holy priest in Father Wade Menezes, who hosts Open Line Tuesday. Father Wade, however, is a human being. Contrary to what some people may think, Father Wade is indeed a human being, and he is susceptible to some of the byproducts of the decisions of our first parents, maybe would be a good way to say that, like the rest of us are. And he's kind of been attacked by some kind of a little stomach bug, and he's not going to be able to join us today. But what a treat that in the absence of such a spectacular host, we can fill in with an equally spectacular host as Dr. David Anders, who has just fought off the flu bug himself, comes out of the bullpen.
Well, I appreciate the kind
for a 2-hour save here in
I
the.
am less sacerdotally endowed than Father Wade, you know. So everybody has their gifts.
They do. Historian, is that how you would characterize your academic description? You think?
I would love to claim the mantle of historian. That was my aspiration at one point in time. Today, I guess I would call myself a catechist, really.
Oh, okay.
You know, because I haven't worked as a practicing professional historian in a long time.
Yeah.
And there are days when I want to go back. You know, walk in the stacks of the library, pulling dusty old tomes off shelves and reading in ancient languages. It does have a certain appeal to me. The life I live now is a little bit more flesh and blood.
There you go. That's Dr. David Anders. He has graciously agreed to sit in for Father Wade today, doing double duty after Call to Communion. You hear him every day at 2 o'clock Eastern on Call to Communion. If you'd like to talk to David Anders, we talk faith, family, and fellowship generally on Tuesdays. And guess what?
I have one of those.
Guess what? He has a family. He has faith, and he's a fellow. What more could you ask for? You
don't
fit
have
the
a ship,
criteria.
but you know.
Well, perhaps we'll work on it.
You know, we had my wife's birthday was last week, and speaking of faith, family, and fellowship,
Happy birthday, Jill Anders.
We had some friends over. Thank you for her birthday, and looked around and noticed that our guests, like, we have a lot of friends that are foreign from other countries, and we had an Indian priest and his parents from Tamil Nadu.
Wow.
We had a French friend of ours was present, a Lebanese friend of ours was present, and a Vietnamese Jesuit novice from L.A. So it was like the United Nations at the dinner table, you know. We had good Catholic fellowship celebrating the universality of the church and my wife's 29th birthday.
Beautiful.
I'm teasing about the 29th.
Wasn't she 29 last year?
She's been 29 a lot of times. Yeah, exactly.
We'll edit that out for the encore. The number to be on the program is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. It's toll-free anywhere in North America. If you're outside the United States and Canada, we'd love to hear from you. Your number is 1-205-271-2985, and we will put you straight to the front of the line at 1-205-271-2985. You can send us a text. Text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for a response. Text your first name and your question, message, and data rates may apply. Or you can send us an email, openline@EWTN.com. I'm Jack Williams. Michael McCall produces the program. Your call screener is Mr. Matt Gubensky. And Jeff Burson handling our social media endeavors. And sitting in today for Father Wade, the aforementioned Dr. David Anders. And what is your official title? Are you the director of adult faith formation? No?
They call me the director of education and lifelong formation.
For the Diocese of Birmingham in Alabama.
Exactly.
Okay. And you've enjoyed that? You've been at it several years now.
It has its good days and its bad days, you know. It's working for. I love working for the church. I love my bishop. I love my colleagues. It's some people think that this is a good lesson actually in Catholic ecclesiology for folks. Okay, the Catholic Church is a lot more decentralized than people think it is. A lot of people think that the Pope or the Bishop is like a CEO who just calls all the shots for everybody. Okay, and actually that's not how it works. One of the principles of Catholic social doctrine and ecclesiastical organization is called subsidiarity,
That's right.
which is that you
Handle
let
things at
you
the
let,
most
you
local
let,
level
you let
possible.
stuff get handled
Yep.
at the local level. And so, when I came to work for the diocese, people said all kinds of things to me. Folks were like, "Oh, Anders, you're going to do this, that, the other thing," and then you step in there and you realize, no, I'm only as effective as I can win friends. I'm only as effective as influence. Not really a question of juridical authority. Even the bishop is limited, like in terms of there's a problem over here, a problem over there. He does not step in. Bishops don't just step in and tell priests just how to brush their own teeth and tie their own shoes. They don't do it. The bishop's responsible for the integrity of the faith, and he ordains men to the pastorate, and he can assign priests to parishes. But individuals have a lot of autonomy in the government of the Catholic Church, and so that's sometimes you spend a lot of times. You talk about fellowship. You spend a lot of times working for the church. I thought at one point I'd come in and do a lot of direct teaching. All right, and you find out what you end up doing is you spend a lot of time trying to make friends with people. Form relationships, put people together. Find somebody in this parish, find somebody in that parish. They're on the same bandwagon, so to speak. They don't know each other. You introduce folks to one another, and that's rewarding, but it's rewarding in a very different kind of way than folks might anticipate.
To that point, I think regardless of how wonderful your message may be, and we certainly have been gifted with a wonderful message from the Creator of the universe.
Yep, amen.
But no matter how wonderful your message is, it's almost worthless if the people you're dealing with are unwilling to listen to what you're saying.
Or if you're not worthy of being listened to.
Oh, there you go.
And I've told the story many times. Before I was Catholic, and I still sort of thought of myself as a Christian apologist, one time thinking that I had just wiped the floor with another guy in theological debate. And I thought, well, what's he going to do now? Is he going to convert, And but he looked at me and said, "But Dave, I don't like Christians." And I went, well, where do I go from there, I mean, and I saw myself through his eyes, and I realized it didn't matter what I say, If he's offended with who I am, I lose a lot of credibility. And then, of course, that wasn't the only thing that made me become Catholic. But, when I did become Catholic, I realized Christ himself tells us, the St. Paul tells us, it doesn't matter if I have knowledge or prophecy or faith that can move mountains. If I lack charity, I am something? No, he says, nothing. Yeah. And for all the emphasis we place on Catholic teaching, I'm comforted to know that we're not going to get a doctrinal exam when we step into heaven, but we will be judged. How? On our charity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, you grew up a couple of miles. 5 miles from the network?
Yeah, 5 miles.
Your entire life? Didn't even know it existed?
Didn't know it was here.
Does that especially motivate you to see to it that as many people as you can don't fall into that same situation?
Well, yeah. I've said a lot of times when I grew up in this city, the only Catholics I knew were ex-Catholics. I didn't know any real live Catholics. And I once actually drove down Old Leeds Road here in front of EWTN probably in the 80s, and I looked out the window and I saw these, ladies in brown robes with, weird, funny head things on. I went, who are they? What are they all about? And I remember my mother saying, "Oh, those are nuns," like it was a bad word. And, get me away from those nuns,
Yeah.
That's what I thought. And it was, and I'd forgotten about it. And of course, EWTN, I don't think existed. That was just Mother Angelica's community.
Right.
And it was, 20 years later or so that I was actually looking for some Catholics to talk to, some converts to talk to help me in my journey. And I called up Marcus Grodi or his organization. And I said, "Do you guys know any Protestants that have become Catholics?" And they're like, "A few, You got any in Birmingham?" And they said, "Yeah, you know about this place called EWTN?" I said, "No, never heard of it." And that's how I first came out here, not to do radio, but to meet people and talk about the faith and learn. And then for the sacraments and then to sing. And actually I was in the choir for a while, and that was one of the weaker moments of EWTN's choir history when they brought me on, to sing second tenor, and then only eventually to get into radio. So that's how I came out here.
When you first walked out here, if someone had painted today's current picture of your involvement here, what would you have thought?
You cannot wake up one day and say, I'd like to go into Catholic radio broadcasting. And I've met people all over the country in Catholic radio. Nobody gets into this that way.
That's right.
Nobody has that, except Elena Rodriguez. She's the one exception.
That's
right.
Right.
It's God draws people to this ministry in peculiar ways, And I've got friends that are so much smarter than I am. They know the faith so much better. They're so much more articulate. And a friend of mine who's got a PhD in philosophy from UPenn, brilliant guy, said to me, how do you get into this Catholic radio gig? And I was like, okay, so what you do first of all is you move 5 miles away from EWTN. Then you start singing in the choir next to the program director's wife, and he's like, oh, okay, I get it.
Just getting started here on EWTN's Open Line Tuesday. Dr. David Anders sitting in for Father Wade Menezes. The number's 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Open Line Tuesday with Dr. David Anders.
Teresa Tomeo.
It's our goal to help each and every listener take this beautiful faith of ours out into the public square with great ideas on making a difference through engaging the culture.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
EWTN Radio Classics is our 24/7 teaching and devotionals channel straight from the EWTN archives. Go Classic with EWTN Radio Classics online at EWTNradio.net and on the EWTN app.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
When the late-term abortionist Kermit Gosnell was convicted for killing a woman and children, Adrienne Moten was his self-described right-hand gal. She served 2 years in prison. When she got out, she called Abby Johnson, who herself had run an abortion facility, but is now working to get people out of the abortion industry. Adrienne talked publicly for the first time and said the day she was arrested was the best day ever. I felt peaceful. I'm just so grateful and thankful to God. During Gosnell's trial, Abby said she realized pro-lifers often dehumanize abortion workers, just as the abortion industry dehumanizes babies. She invites us to pray for abortion workers. I agree. Let's pray for their conversion to Christ, and may they be good ambassadors for the babies.
Like us on Facebook at Life Issues and stay informed, more informed than you've ever been.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985. Or send an email to openline@EWTN.com.
We do this open line thing every day, Monday through Friday. And tomorrow at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, Father Mitch Pacwa will be in the house talking church teaching, ancient languages, sacred scripture, the history of St. Ignatius, all kinds of stuff that Father Mitch will be involved in with us. That's tomorrow, 3 Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. To the phones we go. John is listening in Saginaw, Michigan today, listening via Ave Maria Radio. John, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Yes. Good afternoon, Dr. Anders.
Hey, John. How are you today?
Oh, pretty good. How are you? You getting over your cold?
I'm getting there. Appreciate your prayers.
I have a question.
Okay.
Biblically, it says that Satan was separated from God, but yet we see in the book of Job that it says that God had a discussion with Satan about his servant Job. How can it be that he was separated away, but yet he could still hold a conversation with God?
Okay.
That's the question.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So a number of things to say about this. First of all, Job is clearly a poem, okay? And it's a poem with a moral and theological lesson, and the essential point of the book of Job is to teach us to willingly accept divine providence in our life, even when it's difficult or unpleasant, because there's a purpose that God has in mind that we may not be aware of. Okay, and that lesson right there is the heart of Catholic spirituality: the willingness to embrace even the cross, difficulty, hardship, trial, and suffering, believing in God's goodness and His providence. Right? Even though we cannot see the end, we don't know why God has allowed this to happen, but He's allowed it to happen, and because we trust in God's goodness, we know that something good will come out of it. Okay, that's the point. That's the theological message of the book of Job. Also, it's interesting at the end of Job, you'll notice that we don't ever really see God confronts Job, and He tells Job, where were you when I made the waters and stretched out the heavens and so forth, and Leviathan, and Job says, "Oh, I get it now." But we don't. Like, we hear Job's answer, and it doesn't seem to follow. It's kind of a non sequitur. Well, God didn't really tell us anything we didn't know. What is it that converts Job at the end? It changes his point of view. Well, one Catholic commentator that I like points this out. Says the one thing that was lacking in our experience of that passage that Job did not lack was that immediate second-person awareness of God. Right? So it's not like Job didn't just encounter cognitive information about God. He actually had an experience of God. All right? And you can learn about God all day long and not have an experience of God and remain unconverted. Job had that at the end. So it's very important theological lessons to derive from this book. But clearly it's presented in a poetical and narrative structure with literary qualities that I don't think could, by any stretch of the imagination, be taken as straightforward historical accounts of the way God operates in His divine nature and His eternity. Okay, in the same way, when I read the book of Genesis, I read the account of the creation of the world, and I read that God walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. Well, God doesn't have feet. God's a spirit. God's eternal. God doesn't have feet. God in that passage, calls to Adam like, "Hey, where are you?" Well, it's not like God doesn't know where He is. There are a lot of things in the scriptures that are presented in a kind of language that condescends to our particular limited circumstances and uses language, and not just the words, but the modes of expression and the types of narrative from which we can derive the proper interpretation without necessarily requiring that we read these things as strict literal descriptions of an historical event. All right, so that's one way of approaching that topic. Now, you don't have to take that point of view. I mean, it'll be allowable, a Catholic opinion, to hold that the book of Job really does recount an actual historical event, all right, and is not just a parable, all right. St. Thomas took that position in his commentary on Job, and if memory serves me correct, when he deals with the specific question that you raise, he says, well, we shouldn't conceive of Satan being somehow in physical proximity to God. And that is kind of the way the text seems to make it sound, all right? You imagine sort of God on a throne with the sons of God and the angels sort of ranged in front of Him. And even Thomas, who does take the text in a sort of more literal way, says that's not the way you should think about this, all right? Rather, everything is proximate to God, and Satan is, quote unquote, among the angels only insofar as he was created in equal dignity to them, all right, and shares in their angelic nature and the immateriality and intelligence and so forth. It's in that respect that he's present with the angels in that equal dignity, but certainly not in any sort of physical proximity. It makes no sense to talk of physical proximity to God because God's everywhere. Okay, so there are a lot of things we can bring to bear on the passage. Another one that's I just throw it out there for your consideration, and I'm not going to dogmatize about this one way or the other, is that the Hebrew text speaks about the Satan. All right, Satan in Hebrew means the accuser. All right, now clearly there's a tradition of interpreting the character in the Satan in the book of Job with the historical devil who brought about the fall of Adam and Eve and who's defeated at the end of time. All right. There's another way you could read the text simply as an accuser. It may not be the historical devil, all right? But that's a minority opinion among biblical scholars, all right? So there's a lot of ways you can deal with the difficulty. Now, what does this point to? Hey, there's more than one way to read a biblical text that's allowable within the Catholic tradition, and that's a really good thing. That's a really good thing.
1-833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. A couple lines open for you at 833-288-3986. Next stop, Dallas, Texas. Donna's in Dallas, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Donna, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Well, hello, good afternoon. I must say I do enjoy listening to EWTN, And it's brought me to a point where I want to say that I come from a varied background of Christianity. My Canadian dad was born in an Anglican. My mother, who's half Armenian, had an Orthodox background, although she didn't really practice it. And then, but as I was growing up, my father had rejected the Anglican church, and he didn't even want us to go to church. But my mother had a strong faith, and so even though she didn't drive, we found a place near enough to walk to and go to church at a Presbyterian church. And so I'm grounded with a certain, Christ information. However, as I became mature and explored other religions, I have been drawn to the Catholic Church.
So what's your specific question for Dr. Anders today, Donna?
My specific question is, what would be the first step to go forward in, I guess, a formal study? I know children are taught by catechism and confirmation and that kind of thing. And as an adult, I have a son who lives in another state who married a beautiful Catholic girl and has...
Donna, I think I can help you here.
That is a
simplistically
beautiful question.
Yes, a wonderful question. So the church actually has a program, all right, for inquirers who want to learn more about the faith, potentially with an eye to becoming Catholic, and it's called the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, RCIA, and essentially is lessons in the Catechism. Now, I think I saw from the call screener, you may have already gone through RCIA, and you want... No, you haven't? Okay. Okay, different guy. All right, and if you want more information, then is available in RCIA, a lot of wonderful resources. Of course, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, a rather thick book, right? But it's the sort of the Church's official statement to the world about herself and her beliefs, all right? There are many more resources than that, of course, but if you're up for the challenge of reading this, 1,000, 1,500 pages, something like that, reading the Catechism will tell you exactly what the Church believes on a whole host of issues. Now, the Catechism is not set up to persuade you. All right, that's not its aim. It's not there to convince you of the truth of the Catholic faith, but simply to describe what the faith is, what it consists in. There are other texts I would go to if you want a kind of a larger historical or philosophical or apologetical picture. I think EWTN Religious Catalog has a number of church history texts. One of them, I think, is James Hitchcock's book, History of the Catholic Church, which would be a great sort of one-volume overview. I recommend that as well. And depending on where you're coming from, there are also some good apologetical resources that might not only tell you what the church believes, but why and make the case for it. Peter Kreeft is a Catholic philosopher who writes a lot of very accessible books about the truth of the Catholic faith. Scott Hahn is a very popular author with EWTN audiences who does the same thing but from a different point of view. Carl Keating's little book, Catholicism and Fundamentalism, has been helpful to a lot of people, particularly those coming out of the kind of background you've had. And of course, keep on listening to EWTN radio and television and take full advantage of the EWTN website. And if I can put a plug in here, calldocommunion.com.
And it should be noted that if someone wanted to become involved in the RCIA program, that doesn't lock them into becoming Catholic.
Oh, surely not.
In fact,
yeah.
The first portion of the program is called the inquiry phase.
Right, there you go.
Yeah.
And you actually can endure past the inquiry phase and still not become Catholic if you want to.
That's exactly
it's
right.
It's just like walking to the altar, until that last second you can still walk away.
But I would find one of those good Catholic churches in the Dallas area, go have a little talk with the pastor, and they can send you down the path towards maybe seeing you at Easter Vigil.
Absolutely.
All right. 1-833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. Next up is another Donna. She's in Fayetteville, Arkansas, watching us on YouTube. Donna, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hello.
Hey, Donna.
Hi, I appreciate you taking my call. I came from a background I was born into, one of Jehovah's Witnesses. All my family, from my great-grandmother on, they're all very, very, very involved. My husband and I both were Jehovah's Witnesses up until very recently. So I'm going through shunning right now. Part of my family is, and part is still keeping a little bit of communication, although it's very, very different because we were very close family. I don't want to take up too much of your time because it's kind of a wandering story, but just to cut to the quick, I was really moved by the Pope when he was appointed, and I followed him when he came here to the United States not a few years ago, and I was still a witness, but an active witness at that time. And I was profoundly moved by him and the love that he teaches to have for other Christians and for other people, whether they're Christian or not, and poor people. And he so profoundly moved me. I read everything I can every time I see something on Facebook or anywhere about him.
Well, Donna, sit tight right there. We're going to hear the rest of your story. David's got some comments for you about your situation. We'll also talk to Peter, Fred, Kenneth, and hopefully you. The number's 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. EWTN's Open Line Tuesday. Dr. David Anders sitting in for Father Wade Menezes.
Johnette Benkovic.
Many Catholics have gone AWOL. Maybe they receive Eucharist every single day, but they're AWOL in the marketplace of ideas. We're not going to get to heaven by a popularity vote. Heavens to Betsy, no. We're going to get there because we fulfill the mission and purpose for which we were given life, to be the face of God in our day and time, and that means to speak His name. Hallelujah. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Speak it.
Women of Grace with Johnette Benkovic, Monday through Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
The Reason for Our Hope with Father Larry Richards.
Do you know Christ? Do you know Him intimately? Like you know your wife, like you know your best friend, like you know your children. And if the answer in your heart of hearts is no, I haven't a clue, then you haven't even begun yet to live the purpose of your life. And that's what needs to start happening. You got to deal with that question. It's the most important question of your life. And again, it's going to take you time. You know, how do you fall in love with anybody? Those of you who are married, you didn't get married to your wife by meeting her once and giving her 45 minutes to an hour once a week. You spent time with her. You got to know her. So the same thing has to happen with God. You got to ask that question, and it's going to take you time, but you got to do it. You got to answer that question. My thing is always seek truth, because truth will always lead you to God.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
I said to the sisters one day, what do you think you're going to look like in heaven? Oh, some of them had absolutely magnificent ideas. I didn't think of one of them. And so I got desperate because then my turn came. I didn't know what to say. And so in desperation, I said, what do you think I'll wear in heaven? And they all said with one voice, armor.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Hi, this is Dr. David Anders. There's only one show for non-Catholics, Called to Communion, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Open Line with Father Wade Menezes.
This is Open Line on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. If you have a question or comment, call 1-833-288-EWTN. That's 1-833-288-3986. Outside North America, call 1-205-271-2985 or send an email to openline@ewtn.com.
You know, if we had known Father Wade was going to be ill a little sooner, we could have had you record throwing the show back to yourself. Father, how am I doing? I just ordained you. Dr. David Anders sitting in today for Father Wade Menezes, and we're talking to Donna in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Donna was born into the Jehovah's Witnesses, was deeply touched by our Holy Father, Pope Francis, and followed him on his trip to the United States. Donna, what question do you have for Dr. Anders today?
Well, I went through the RCIA program, but just as a person just inquiring. So I never had any intention of getting baptized at the end of that, but I did go through the whole program, and I was profoundly touched by it. My husband also went with me, but some of the concerns that I have and that, you know, he's brought up to me, and I agree, is that if the Catholic Church was established by Christ and his and the apostles that he sent out, how I just don't understand how like the Inquisition, where people that refused to convert, were killed in God's name. And I know it's not only in the Catholic Church that things like this have happened, but certainly they are well known for that.
Okay.
And I've been profoundly moved, but I just don't know how to reconcile some of the things that have happened.
Thanks. I appreciate the question, Donna, a lot. So I have a lot to say about this. And one thing I want to say is clearly Catholics in history have done bad things. Catholics today do bad things. I'm a Catholic. I've done bad things, okay? Jack Williams over here has even done a bad thing or two, right? And so I don't want to take anything away from that truth. Now, that being said, the PR image, so the propaganda image of the Catholic Church in historical reporting or in popular media is often very far from the truth. And that is the case whether we're talking about the Inquisition or the Crusades, or you take whatever historical period is under consideration where the church is pilloried or made to look bad. Generally, there's a lot more to the story than is being reported. All right. So a lot of times it's not as bad as it looks on the surface. Now, there may be an individual or a group of individuals who do really, really atrocious things, but the church institutionally and collectively has done far more good in the world than evil. Now, the very fact that you raise this kind of question, all right, the very fact that you raise this kind of question points to the influence of the Catholic Church in history to raise our collective awareness about the reality of human dignity. Okay, so for instance, if I went to Genghis Khan, and I said, "What is all this about you, raping and pillaging and conquesting all over the world? How can you possibly do that? Isn't that?" I mean, he would have looked at me and lopped my head off, basically. And we actually have a historical record. There was a Catholic Pope in the Middle Ages who wrote not to Genghis Khan but to one of his descendants when this fellow was assailing Catholics in Central Europe. And the Pope wrote to him and said, what wrong have these people done to you, all right, that you feel justified in lopping off their heads and stealing their wives and their daughters and taking their lands and their sheep? And the Khan writes him back. We actually have this. This is in the Vatican archives. He writes the Pope back and says, "I don't understand the question. They have stuff I want. I've got swords and horses. Why shouldn't I take it?" Okay? And we take it for granted that we can have a policy discussion at the level of international policy about human rights. Well, where does that idea emerge? Where does the whole concept of human rights come from that we can have a conversation about genocide or the right way to treat people in warfare? These are Catholic intellectual ideas. All right? Outside the history of Catholicism, you don't have a well-formed concept of human rights. You certainly don't have a well-formed concept of human dignity, right, influencing public policy. And even the Inquisition or the Crusades, even the Inquisition, for instance, in the Roman Inquisition, which is different from the Spanish, it was not uncommon for criminals, people who were murderers or rapists or thieves, to deliberately commit heresy on purpose because they wanted their trials transferred into inquisitorial courts, because they knew that the standards of evidence, that the judicial procedure and so forth was so much more fair as exercised by the church than what they would find in civil society. Okay, so there's a huge perspective to bring to bear there. Now, if you'd like a good book on the topic and this and similar topics, I recommend Tom Wood's book, How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. Right, and Professor Woods does a good job of explaining how even the premises of your question, all right, derive ultimately from Catholic moral thinking. All right, now, so that's the first thing I have to say. The second one is the Catholic Church, as such, to my knowledge, has never perpetrated any horrific event like this. There have been individual Catholics with their own political or social agenda, all right, or their own ambition, that have done sometimes incredibly noble and praiseworthy things, sometimes wretched and horrible things, all right? And as you correctly point out, you're not going to find any institution on the planet comprised of human beings that doesn't have a similarly storied past, especially one that has as long a history as the Catholic Church. In a culture in which everybody is Catholic, like, say, medieval Spain or something, or early modern Spain, or modern France, a culture in which everybody or the vast majority of people are Catholic, by definition, all of the crooks, shysters, and corrupt politicians will be Catholic. By definition, because everybody in the culture is Catholic. All right? Now, does the Catholic Church teach that by nominal adherence to the Catholic faith, that all of us will be instantly purged of every inclination to sin. No. On the contrary, Jesus himself said, "Many people will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord,' and I will say to you, 'I never knew you.'" All right? The apostles dealt with this question when they said, Jesus, we have people doing bad stuff in your name. And Jesus says, leave it. Leave it. Leave the tares with the wheat. The angels will sort it out at the end of time. All right? Not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," to me will enter the kingdom of heaven. So just because somebody is nominally Catholic doesn't mean that they're cooperating with the grace of God or living in a way that's consistent with their Christian vocation. And the New Testament is filled with this kind of stuff. Most of the letters of the New Testament, most of the letters of St. Paul, deal with problems in churches, some of them serious. So if you read the letter to Paul's first letter to Corinthians, for example, the reason Paul wrote the letter is the church was divided into factions and by sexual immorality. All right, the letter of 3 John, the apostle writes regarding a bishop named Diotrephes, who was a bad guy, and he was actually disfellowshipping people because they maintained relationships with St. John the Apostle. So even in the apostolic era, corruption, sexual immorality, abuse was rampant, and occasioned many of the letters in the New Testament. Now, that's not a reason not to be Catholic or not to be Christian, because what the gospel promises is that Christ has made grace available to us in the sacraments and in the church. And the fact that there are saints, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, St. Francis of Assisi, you name it, is evidence that when we freely cooperate with that grace, we can reach the heights of sanctity. But God doesn't put a gun to our head and make us cooperate.
God bless you, Donna. We will keep you in our prayers. Next up is Peter. He's in Worcester, Mass., listening on Emmanuel Radio. Peter, you're on with Dr. David Anders. Hi, Peter. Are you there?
Yes.
Go right ahead with your question for Dr. Anders.
The question is, now, if Mary is the woman in Revelation chapter 12, how come she is portrayed as travailing and wailing while bringing forth a man?
Sure. Yeah, I can help you with that. I appreciate it. So the woman in Revelation chapter 12 is clearly a typology. All right. Now, what is a typology? A typology is a biblical figure. It's a literary figure where you have one historical person or event that stands in for some trans-historical reality or for some future fulfillment. Okay. And the text in Revelation chapter 12 is complex in its reference. Okay. So at one level, clearly, the woman of Revelation chapter 12 is an allegory for the church. All right. It's an allegory for the church. And as such, we can consider her in her travail of persecution, right, as she gives birth to new Christians. You know, Tertullian, the North African Christian writer, said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And as the church travails in persecution, she produces more converts, all right, and gives birth to more, right? So clearly, at one level, the woman of Revelation chapter 12 is a typology or an allegory for the church. But as is the case with most allegories in sacred scripture, the typological fulfillment is presaged by a real historical person. In this case, the Blessed Virgin Mary. All right, and the identification of Mary with Revelation chapter 12 is not adventitious. There's a biblical basis for this. So Jesus himself identifies Mary with the woman of biblical prophecy in Genesis 3:15 in two passages in John chapter 2 and John chapter 19. He says woman. He addresses her as woman. He doesn't call her mom. He calls her Mary. He calls her woman. All right, my hour has not come, or my hour has come. And that woman of Genesis 3:15 is also figured again in Revelation chapter 12, because we see one of the things the woman of Revelation chapter 12 does is confront that ancient serpent, the devil. So clearly there's a parallelism between Genesis 3, John 2, John 19, and Revelation 12. We have historical Eve, we have historical Mary, we have the typology of the church, and we have her fulfillment in the kingdom of heaven.
Still time for your phone calls at 833-288-EWTN, toll-free anywhere in North America, 833-288-3986. Next up is Fred. He's in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, listening on Catholic Community Radio. Fred, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Dr. Andrews, I thoroughly enjoy your show and appreciate it very much. My question is, when the Holy Spirit came upon the apostles at Pentecost, obviously in the span of a few minutes, they became they received a PhD in Catholic apologetics, along with the ability to raise the dead, cure the sick. They were inspired in what to say and what to do in multiple languages and so forth. When did St. Paul acquire these abilities?
Okay, thanks. So Paul was commissioned directly by Christ, and we read that in the account of his conversion in Acts chapter 9, when he sends Paul directly with the competence of an apostle to bear witness to the resurrection and to convert the Gentiles. Now we know that he was actually baptized by Ananias, and scales fell from his eyes and so forth. In terms of actually receiving the sacrament of holy orders or ordination, there's no record of that in the Bible, all right? But, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, all right? And he did have hands laid upon him at Antioch and sent out on his missionary journeys. And we know he believed very much in the sacrament of ordination because he mentions it in the pastoral epistles and instructs Timothy and Titus that they're to lay hands on successors who can carry on their apostolic ministry. And Paul refers to himself as a priest in Romans chapter 15, specifically uses the word priest to speak about his own identity. So in terms of the apostolic commission, that comes in his conversion in Acts chapter 9. In terms of the sacrament of holy orders, I don't think Scripture tells us precisely when and how and under what circumstances that takes place. I wish I could tell you that I remember the biography of Paul from Eusebius's ecclesiastical history. If I were going to go investigate that question right now, that's one place I would go look. I mean, Eusebius is one of our earliest church historians, wrote in the 4th century. He was in the court of Charlemagne, not Charlemagne, Constantine, and I would go dig through Eusebius and see what he says about Paul's ordination. But again, we know that he was a priest because he calls himself a priest, and we know that he was an apostle because Christ commissioned him directly.
Richard's watching on Facebook Live. He says, how much Catholic doctrine do you have to agree with to consider yourself Catholic?
Sure, thanks. You have to believe everything that the Church declares to be revealed by God, okay? And that's a subtle answer to your question, all right? Because not every Catholic doctrine falls into that category, all right? There are things that the Church says, this is true because God has revealed it, all right? Those are called dogmas of the faith, all right? And when the Church defines a dogma, all right, as something divinely revealed, then we're obligated to believe it. Okay, we have to agree, and we have to believe all of it. We can't pick and choose among dogmas. I can't be a Catholic and say, well, I'm going to take a pass on transubstantiation. No, it doesn't work that way. Okay. On the other hand, there are traditions of teaching within the Catholic Church, say schools of theological thought and so forth, that accompany the proclamation of the gospel. All right, and may have a lot of weight on their side, but they don't constitute a dogma, okay? And let me take a really arcane example, very arcane example. The Church teaches dogmatically that we can do no good without grace. That's a dogma. All right, we have to have grace. And that we can't earn grace. Right, that's also a dogma, okay? So some people imagine that, hey, if God just makes a sort of general offer of grace, leaves it up to me whether to accept it or not, and if I do, boom, he comes and responds by giving me grace. Actually, no. That's a heresy called semi-Pelagianism. All right, Church condemned it at the Council of Orange in 529. All right, if I believe at all, if I respond to grace at all, it's only because God's grace was active in me from the get-go, motivating me to say yes. Okay, now, but why does God give grace to this person or at that time or in this way rather than to another? That's a question on which the Dominican school of thought gives one answer, and the Jesuit school of thought gives another. Now, those are the answers to that question. Well, we could talk about them as doctrinal answers, right, because Catholic theologians have held them. It's a very speculative question, but it's one about which the Church has absolutely refused to dogmatize. Right? There are schools of thought that are allowable within Catholic tradition on some ancillary issues. Okay? Another one would be, say, for instance, the Church has taught dogmatically that the death penalty, in principle, is licit. Licit means it's not intrinsically immoral to impose a death penalty. Pope John Paul II articulated his prudential judgment that it wasn't a good idea, right? It wasn't a good idea to exercise that prerogative in the modern era, and he gives arguments in favor of that position. Okay, and so as a policy position, the overwhelming majority of Catholic bishops today oppose the death penalty. But the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, right, which is the Church's chief doctrinal authority, has said that it is not necessary for Catholics to adhere to that judgment with the obedience of faith. So you could disagree with that as a policy position. All right, the dogma you can't disagree with. This or that interpretation, this or that policy position, this or that controverted question, you can listen to argument and form your own opinion. This is the beauty of the Catholic faith. We have a principled way of distinguishing between dogma and opinion. I once asked a Protestant friend of mine, how do you tell the difference between dogma and opinion? And he said, I don't know. And he went and asked his pastor, how do we know the difference between dogma and opinion? You know what his pastor told him, Jack? He said, he said, how could you sit in my church for all these years and not know the difference between dogma and opinion? In other words, I'm dogma.
That's right.
That's what the answer was. And my buddy thought about it for a while, and 6 months, a year later, he became Catholic. All right? That's a beautiful thing about the Catholic Church.
Some of our evangelical brothers and sisters, dogma is a 4-letter word.
I would like to have a pet named Dogma.
Oh, goodness gracious. Hot off the presses from EWTN Publishing, Sanctify Your Daily Life, How to Transform Work into a Source of Strength, Holiness, and Joy. We all, for the most part, have to work in some capacity or another. This was written by the mentor of the late, great St. John Paul II, Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski. And this tome will teach you how to learn to change any workplace into a workshop for sanctity, for yourself and for those around you, how to avoid burnout at home or at the office, 5 steps, I love this, to praying in work instead of merely at work, and much, much more. It's available at EWTNRC.com. Sanctify Your Daily Life, written by Pope John Paul II's mentor, Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski, available at EWTNRC.com. Next up is Kenneth. He's in Greenville, South Carolina, listening on Catholic Radio in South Carolina. Kenneth, what's your question today for Dr. Anders?
Good afternoon. My question concerns St. Mary Magdalene. I recently either heard or read, I can't remember, that the commonly held belief that St. Mary Magdalene was a prostitute is an invention of the last few centuries or so, and that there's no scriptural basis for it. So my question is that true? And if so, what did we believe prior to this invention?
Okay, thanks. Actually, it's a little bit older than that. It's a medieval tradition that identifies Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and the sinful woman of the Gospels. It anoints the feet of Jesus. And so it's a commonly held opinion in Catholic tradition, but it's not a dogma of the faith. And so while it's a commonly held opinion, you could consider arguments for or against the position within biblical scholarship. And that's really the way I would go about this. Whenever I want to understand a passage of Scripture or the identification of a character, I'm going to consult a good Catholic biblical commentary and, read both sides of an issue. But I mean, it's a safe opinion, and it's one that's represented in art and literature and so forth within Catholic culture. But it's not the kind of thing it's not worth going to the mat over.
Next up is Michael. He is in Frederick, Maryland, listening to EWTN on Guadalupe Radio. Michael, you're on with Dr. Anders.
Hi, Dr. Anders. I'm a convert. I have no problem discussing the differences between Protestantism, the various versions, and Catholicism. My stumbling block is Orthodox versus Catholic, as far as how we differ and how we know that the Catholic Church is the correct church, because Orthodox they seem to have so many similarities. So if you could just touch on that.
Yeah, sure. I really appreciate the question. So they are, of course, very similar, Orthodoxy and Catholicism, because they used to both adhere to the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Faith, and their division is the result of the sin of schism, not profound theological differences. Okay, and so that speaks to their similarity. And in fact, they're so similar, all right, that the Catholic Church regards the Orthodox with a kind of liberality that she denies to other Christian communities. So, for instance, a Protestant cannot receive communion in a Catholic church, cannot receive Catholic sacraments, except under very specific circumstances like danger of death, for instance. But the Orthodox can. They can, all right? In fact, I have Orthodox friends that go to confession and receive communion quite regularly in Catholic churches. And it's because the Church respects their sacraments as valid, their ordination is valid, their apostolic succession is valid, and believes that most of what separates us really is politics, culture, and history rather than deep theology. Now, as to your question, well, how do I know the Catholic claim is true? Okay, well, the big long answer to that, let's start with the teaching of Jesus himself. So a core thesis in Orthodoxy is that the way you know the faith, the way you know the truth and the identity of the Church is the consensus of the bishops expressed in council, all right? And of course, I would immediately say, okay, well, where does Jesus reveal that? Where did Christ say the way I know the content of the faith, that the ultimate rule of faith of the Church is the consensus of bishops meeting in council? Now, obviously, conciliar decree is an important part of Catholic tradition, but Christ actually gives us a different rule of faith. When you look at the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 16, Jesus identifies St. Peter as the rock foundation of the Church's unity. He gives to him the keys of the kingdom of heaven and the promise that what he binds on earth will be bound in heaven. And it's to St. Peter that he gives the charge to feed his sheep and to strengthen the brethren. And it's to Peter that Paul first goes when he wants to receive the right hand of fellowship, lest he run his race in vain. And that witness to Petrine authority and Petrine supremacy is continued in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, down to the 21st century tradition in unbroken succession. And even among the Orthodox, even among the Greeks, even among the Byzantines, you find a witness to that doctrine of papal supremacy. And when you're asked for explanation, well, why is it there? Why does it pass to Rome? All right, the consistent answer we have in history and sacred tradition is that it was specifically the Petrine office that passed to the Bishop of Rome. Now, interestingly, the Byzantine Church in the 4th century, right, at the Council of Constantinople in 381, there were some Byzantine theologians that said, hey, we acknowledge that Rome has the primacy, but hey, shouldn't we transfer it to Constantinople now that Constantinople is the seat of the empire? All right, they acknowledged the primacy, but they wanted to change the basis from Petrine authority to simple political primacy in the empire. Guess how much traction that theory got in the 4th century? None. Not among the Latins, not among many of the Greeks, not among the Syriacs, not among the Copts. That didn't fly. That dog won't hunt. Okay, and so you have the teaching of Christ, you have the witness of sacred tradition, and then finally, I would say, even if you look at Orthodoxy in its own terms, there's some serious internal inconsistencies in Orthodox ecclesiology. So, for instance, one of them is that they don't give you enough time to finish your show to answer this good question. But if the Orthodox are going to determine the content of the faith by conciliar decree, it's necessary to know who has a valid council. All right? Well, how do you know that in Orthodoxy? Circular reasoning. They say, well, the real church has valid councils. Well, how do you know the real church? We're the ones who accept the valid councils. And there are competing versions of Orthodoxy, of course, the Copts, the Assyrians, the Byzantines, without any principled way of distinguishing among them. You got to get outside the circle to an authority established by Christ to determine who has a real faith, who has the real church, who has a real council. And Christ gave us that. He set that up for us within the Catholic Church through the primacy of St. Peter.
On behalf of our host, Dr. David Andrews, producer Michael McCall, call screener Matt Kubensky, and our social media maven, Mr. Jeff Burson, I'm Jack Williams. Thanks for tuning in. Back at it tomorrow with Father Mitch. Until then, God bless.
called me up.
Did he throw you under the bus, or?
Sorta.
Yeah.
But what he did is he had to make a decision, and he wanted us to own it. So he'd have to bear the consequences of his own decision, and so he.
Yeah,
I don't mind doing
these
it.
now. So they're on the air already, so the sooner I can get them to him, the better.
Yeah.